Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Henning, Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. There have been relatively little movements along the front lines in Ukraine this past week. The tide of the bloody battle for Bakhmut seems to be turning back and forth. We are writing day 400 of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The past few days saw the arrival of British Challenger as well as German Leopard 2 tanks and also of various Western-made armed fighting vehicles. We have delivered as promised. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz confirmed the sidelines of consultations with the Dutch government in The Hague this week. Earlier last week, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Moscow for an opulent 3-day state visit, telling his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin when he parted, quote, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. And we are the ones driving these changes together." And Putin agreed to that. In a remarkable juxtaposition, at the same time, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida visited Bucha, the town where Russia's massive war crimes committed against Ukrainian civilians first came to light, and Kiev, for talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky. Kishida called Russia's invasion a, quote, "disgrace that undermines the foundations of the international legal order," while Xi had nothing to say on the subject while in Moscow. There had been talk about a possible telephone or video call between Presidents Xi and Zelensky, but that seems not to have materialized yet. Yesterday, Zelensky invited Xi to Kiev in an interview with the Associated Press. China's role in Russia's war against Ukraine will play a key part of our discussion this morning. It is also another chance to take stock and try to envisage where the war is headed. And for this, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Pavlo Klimkin, who was Ukraine's Minister for Foreign Affairs between 2014 and 2019. Between 2012 and 2014, he served as ambassador to Germany, having started his diplomatic career in 1993. This morning, he will focus his remarks on the situation in Ukraine and share his view on the role of China is currently playing. A very warm welcome, Ambassador Klimkin, who's joining us from Kiev, I believe. Next, we will have with us Dr. Maria Shagina, a Diamond Brown Senior Research Fellow for Economic Sanctions, Standards and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, also known as the IISS in London. She has followed closely the effects of sanctions and will this morning touch on China's role in keeping Russia's economy going. Good morning, Maria. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. András Rácz, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. András is one of the leading experts on the Russian military and will once more share his insights into the current military situation. A very good morning to András.
Morning.
Who's joining us from London, and he has to leave a little early. I should flag that up. Each speaker has 6 to 7 minutes for their introductory remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments roughly after 30 minutes. Please, for the Q&A, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question in person to the panel. You are also welcome to use the chat function and use this for comments and questions, and I will try to put this to the panel. Please note that this event will be recorded and that we have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. And with a word of thanks to my colleague Milan Nitsch, the DGAP Central and Eastern Europe expert, who has been instrumental in organizing these events, and to Dr. Jan Stöckmann from the Director's Office, who is supporting the series going forward, as well as to our colleagues in the events and communications teams. Let's turn to András for his assessment.
Good morning again. Thank you for all of you for joining us today morning. As usual, I'm trying to use again the maps produced by the Institute for the Study of War. So please allow me to share the map. Now it actually should work. Now you are supposed to see the map of the wider Donbass and the Kharkiv region. Do you see the map? Good, perfect. So not much has changed on the front lines since our last talk. This has mostly weather and climate-related reasons. This year, due to the climate change, due to the unusually warm winter, the ground hasn't frozen. So basically, since February, there is a continuous period of Rasputitsa, or bezdorozhye in Ukrainian. So deep mud, and the fields are practically impassable for mechanized forces, which makes it very hard for either of the sides to conduct any larger offensive operations. So most of the battles are static positional fights. Most interesting, most intensive ones, excuse me. So the most intensive ones are going on here on the border of Luhansk region and Kharkiv region. Russian forces are slowly progressing, but slowly here means literally a few hundred meters, slowly progressing here in this part, but still the most intensive fighting continues to take place around Bakhmut and south of Bakhmut at Avdiivka. Let's take a bit closer look on both of them. Just scrolling down here. The situation at Avdiivka is steadily worsening and worsening a lot quicker than at Bakhmut. Russian forces managed to encircle Avdiivka and are deepening the encirclement both in the north and in the south of the city. So by many people focus on Bakhmut, here I would caution against directing all the attentions at Bakhmut, because the situation at Avdiivka right now looks developing into a much more critical direction. Why Avdiivka matters? Because as long as Avdiivka is in Ukrainian hands, under Ukrainian control, from there it's possible to exercise fire control over large parts of Donetsk, and also keep under fire control the important railway lines here in this region. Should Avdiivka fall, should Ukrainian forces be pushed back westwards, then Russians would have considerable more autonomy and freedom of using these railway lines in this part of the Donetsk region. The situation at Bakhmut, this is a higher resolution map on Bakhmut. You see that more than 80% of the city is already under Russian control, under Russian control. Both the Wagner group forces as well as Russian regular units are fighting here. They are slowly, gradually closing the pincer around the city. President Zelensky recently again visited Bakhmut. Why I'm saying again, because once he visited Bakhmut already in December. So Bakhmut has a high symbolic importance for Ukraine, for the defenders, in addition to its military importance. Still, even if Bakhmut falls, because it may eventually fall, the defense of the city fulfilled the main task it was supposed to fulfill. It bogged down considerable Russian forces for several months, and here Ukrainians managed to cause staggering losses for the Russian armed forces, as well as for the Wagner group. So even if Bakhmut falls, the city already served the purpose of winning time for Ukraine and relieving the pressure on other sections of the front line. So yes, we need to keep watching Bakhmut, because the battle is not yet over, but the situation of the Ukrainian defenders is increasingly critical. Second thing, on the long-awaited Ukrainian counterattack, yesterday there was a clear remark from leading Ukrainian officials that should climate situation improve, should the weather situation improve, should the ground dry, Ukraine may soon launch a counterattack. Late April or May were mentioned, depending on the weather. As Henning already pointed out, with the arrival of the first batches of modern Western heavy tanks, this counteroffensive might become possible sooner than originally anticipated. Here I'd like to remind many of you that originally many people were skeptical about the speed of how the Challengers or the Leopard 2s could be delivered, where the first ones arrived much earlier than originally planned. Last thing, during the weekend, President Putin declared that Russia intends to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Of course, this made it all over into the news all over the world. Anyways, it's about deployment of nuclear weapons somewhere abroad, but there are some important details here. First, this doesn't mean that nuclear weapons would be transferred to Belarus. These nuclear weapons will remain in Russian ownership under Russian command. So this is a deployment of Russian nuclear weapons abroad and not arming Belarus with any kind of nuclear weapons. So there is no nuclear proliferation in the sense that there is no new nuclear power created, first. Second, the deployment is not going to take place immediately. Russia indicated that the facilities necessary for storing these weapons will be completed only by the 1st of July, and deployment might take place only thereafter. We don't know exactly when. We also don't know the types of weapons Russia plans to deploy to Belarus. But third point here, taking into account that Russia anyways already enjoyed full nuclear escalation dominance over Ukraine, both when it comes to tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. A deployment to Belarus does not change the strategic situation to any significant extent. It's not good, of course, but there is not much need for panic. The deployment for Belarus does not significantly change either the threat level of NATO or of Ukraine, particularly because in the Kaliningrad region, Russia has already stationed not only tactical, but also strategic nuclear weapons. So compared to the Kaliningrad deployment, the deployment to Belarus matters way less than many people anticipated. So that's it from me for the start. Again, I apologize for having to leave a bit earlier, around 9:15 Berlin time. But still, if there are any questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, András. Let's move on to Pavlo Klimkin, please. Klimkin, sorry.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. Thanks, András, for your assessment. I genuinely agree with your assessment, what's going on the ground. Let me make 3 points to start. One, about situation in Ukraine, and especially about mentality, about the mood. And it's quite good. Basically, it's even improving. And you see it in our opinion polls, in direct opinion polls and focuses, but also you feel it if you talk to people. Whether it's Kyiv, whether it's central western part of Ukraine, or for example, Odessa, where I have a number of friends. The reasons are multiple, but actually it's matching in the sense of change on electricity supply, and of course district heating is not a real issue anymore. Winter is back for a couple of days now in Kyiv with the temperatures below zero, but everybody expects still spring to come in. So after all kind of blackouts and cuts, it's a different feeling, of course, for many, many people, because it's a sense that normality, at least, partial normality is back. Secondly, of course, it's about emotionally driven expectation for the future counterattack, or better to say counterattacks. And of course, the expectations are not just running high, they are running amazingly high here. There is, of course, a sort of risk that if there are going to be delays or any sort of problems, challenges on the way, I would not expect it could tremendously change, but some emotional blows could be there, and it's basically a sort of concern for many people here. And on the top of that, it's actually spring. It's a good mood, and I talked recently to many representatives of Ukrainian businesses. They actually believe the situation is extremely challenging. but they are quite creative. They were able to change the supply lines. They believe they could at least maintain the current level. The IMF program, I don't know if Maria would specially focus on it in her economic briefing, but IMF program in general is also there. It want to be quite challenging in the sense of all benchmarks, but it should help Ukraine to be more resilient. And so far, in an economic sense, I believe Ukraine is amazingly resilient. When you talk especially to small and medium businesses, but also big ones like logistics, kind of even heavy industries, but definitely we've been facing a fundamental challenge of figuring out what kind of economic model we could have in the future for such cities as Kharkiv or Mykolaiv. Because machine building is not there, education is a pillar not there, IT definitely not there. Basically, we have to reinvent economic models for a number of cities. And we've been focusing on that in a very special way. I believe the oncoming conferences, including London in June, could specially focus exactly on this issue. So in the sense of mood, in mentality, I believe it's really quite good. Now it could change in the future, but so far I'm really proud of my fellow Ukrainians. The second point, reflecting very shortly on what András said on Belarusian nuclear weapons, and I started my humble diplomatic career on nuclear disarmament on START 1 and IBM treaties. So I believe there is a risk of nuclear proliferation here. Putin said clearly that they are in the process of readjusting Belarusian planes for being able to carry nuclear weapons. Actually, it's a clear intent to break the treaties. It's not about Russian planes, how he said. It's about Belarusian planes to keep control over the nukes is one point. And to start preparing in a real sense for using Belarusian weapons and Belarusian infrastructure is already a clear intent. And I believe Putin is very clear and intentional on that. There is a clear strategy behind it. There is a clear strategy to make Belarus dependent on nukes, to make Lukashenko dependent on that, with all kind of fear around and the oncoming elections, basically elections, you understand. So I believe there should be a special conversation in some moment in time focused on Belarus. And the third point, as I've been asked to reflect on China, look, from what I know from my different sources, I believe the Russians have not got what they wanted in the sense of comprehensive all-out support from the Chinese. At least what we follow now is no direct supply of Chinese weapons to Russia. There were a couple of breaches, but not clearly significant, and it's not about heavy weapons. Actually, I don't see clear ground, any clear ground now for Xi Jinping to break up his normal behavior. Basically, what's going on is serving long-term Chinese interests. Russia is weakening, but not weakening to the extent which could come uncomfortable for China. The internal control, as Chinese experts believe, is still there in Russia. China, keeps creating a number of challenges for the West because of this war. So fundamentally, for me, it matches the Chinese mentality. You mentioned the possible interaction, possible contacts between us and the Chinese. And my point, what I hear from the Chinese experts, I've been in contact for such a time. China so far is not interested in becoming immediately a sort of mediator between Ukraine and China. And I understand that from the point of Chinese interest. Tell me just one serious reason why China should engage now. Xi Jinping understands Putin's position quite well. He understands Putin's position is vulnerable, but he does not see, as I don't see, that Putin has not, kind of has changed his fundamental goals of Ukraine. He has not. So in our case, of course, it's about preparing for the counterattack. It's about territorial integrity. And the Chinese believe they are great, they can discuss. What it actually does not mean to have and to keep territorial integrity. So for them, it's about principles, but for them, it's about discussions at the same time. So I believe they are playing in their system of coordinates. They are not, pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. Of course, Russia is important for them. They will keep using the Russians in the sense of resources, in the sense of creating problems for the West. And the Chinese are very attentive to what's going on in the US now. So fundamentally, it's a big game for them, and Xi Jinping gonna decide in what moment and under what conditions he could or he could not engage. So fundamentally, this moment, as I understand it, for the Chinese is definitely not there, which actually leads to some irritation here in Kiev in the sense of understanding, or better to say, trying to understand the Chinese role. And the last simple point, the visit of Lula, the president of Brazil, had been canceled because of his pneumonia. I understand it's now rescheduled for the 11th of April, and it's really a visit to watch for me. Because a lot would depend in the sense of positioning of the non-Western world on what they can or can't agree in Beijing. So fundamentally, Lula has his own view, and the Brazilians have been working on different ideas. So it could be kind of not defining, but important moment together with the visit of Macron and von der Leyen to Beijing. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Klimkin. Very fascinating the insights you're giving us from Kyiv. As you say, there's lots of traveling diplomacy coming up with Macron and von der Leyen visiting Beijing next week. Von der Leyen will give a keynote speech on China policy, I think, this morning. So there's sort of many moving parts, but I take your assessment that for the Chinese at this moment, there's no really much of a incentive to get involved at this point. Let's now go to Maria Shagina, please, and then we will soon open up for your questions and comments. Maria, please.
Good morning from my side. I think it's a perfect segue to zoom in on Russia-China relations. We talked about Ukraine's resilience, but it's also important to talk about Russia's resilience and the role of China, how much this relationship can shape or shorten or speed up this war. So we saw the Xi-Putin meeting last week, and the optics there obviously of support as much as it can possibly happen today. But their relationship are as closer than ever in history, but also as asymmetrical as never in history. And sanctions have exacerbated this relationship between the two. It's hard to hide the fact that Russia is a junior partner here. I think that the word choice is crucial here. Some people use vassal or a puppet. I'll stick to the junior partner. And that asymmetry, particularly in the economic relationship, was reflected in the list of announced deals, or at least Russia's readiness to do quite a lot for China, but not so much in return. And also the fact that the no-limit partnership phrase was no longer featured in Xi's statement, so also an indication on the limitations, again, what China can do for Russia. Also, since the beginning of the war, a lot has changed. Russia's economic dependence on China is not new. It has been going on there since 2014, basically. But Russia used to balance off its economic dependence on China with two other dimensions. It's military and diplomatic. Russia used to supply quite a lot of weapons to China, also one of the modern ones. And China used to look up to Russia in international organizations for its diplomatic prowess. Now that relationship has changed. It is Russia that is looking to China to ask for lethal weapons or critical materials for its war effort. And it's also China that is floating this 12-point peace plan. So that relationship again underlines how much asymmetrical the relationship became. For Russia, a relationship with China is a marriage of geopolitical necessity. Moscow has been pivoting to the east for many years, but this time is for real because it's the only game in town, given the unprecedented sanctions on Russia. And that is reflected also in their relationship in terms of bilateral trade that hit a record of $180 billion last year. China became the main buyer of almost all Russian commodities that to a certain extent mitigated the impact of sanctions. Moscow became the main supplier of oil to China, surpassing Saudi Arabia. Also, sale of Russian oil has surged by 20% to China. LNG has soared by 40%. Gold transfers have increased by 60%. But all of that is happening at deep discounts, which to me underlines the fact that it was true in 2014 and it's now that China is ultimately acting in its international interests, and it used to and is doing now. It's capitalizing on Russia's isolation in terms of purchasing its cheap commodities and using all other ways to push its national interests. And it's not a benevolent partner that will help Russia to mitigate the sanctions pressure at no cost. China has also become a leading provider of, at the moment, lower-end semiconductors and drones, which obviously has a direct impact on the battlefield. There is no evidence of lethal weapons, and one can argue that China would cross the line, not just for the US, but also for Europe. And given that China is trying to tone down its Wolf warrior diplomacy, at the moment there is no particular interest to do so, but that's the space to watch, obviously. China has also become the main supplier of cars, given the quite a strong hit on the Russian automotive industry. Electronics and machineries are also on the rise. The other dimension, which I think is important to highlight here, is the financial one. So again, economic independence is not new, but using yuan in financial transactions is. Yuan is no longer an exotic currency anymore, neither for businesses nor for households. And that penetration goes deeper than just cross-border settlements. Yuan became de facto reserve currency for the National Welfare Fund. A lot of it will be diversified from Western currencies to yuan. And now Russia has $45 billion of yuan in securities and deposits, given that $300 billion are now immobilized in the West. Also, Russian exports are being increasingly paid in yuan. Its share has increased from 4% to 16% now. And that is, for example, reflected in Gazprom's announcement that its contracts will be issued now only in yuan and rubles. The same is happening for coal and other commodities that Russia is trying to trade. Also on the households level, since last year, since March last year, every third foreign account in Russian banks was opened in yuan. Now, more than 50 Russian banks are offering yuan-denominated deposits, which is obviously a big change. At the Moscow Stock Exchange, the pair yuan-ruble has ballooned to unprecedented levels. And finally, companies also started raising yuan-denominated bonds, which wasn't the case before. Recently, it was Rosneft that issued the second largest yuan-denominated bond on the market. Yet, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are obviously limits in the so-called no-limit partnership between the two, and there are the following. First of all, China is not this benevolent partner that will rescue Russia from the sanctions pressure. Beijing is a globally integrated economy, is wary of secondary sanctions, and it's still a concern how to navigate this space between trying to mitigate the pressure, not to let Russia be humiliated, but at the same time to stay away from US secondary sanctions. Second, China's appetite for Russia's energy is also not limitless. We've seen lack of really support response from Xi for Power of Siberia too. Beijing is really in no rush to sign that deal as it was in 2014, or was the first pipeline. And that comes down to the I think, simple fact for China that energy security is really sacrosanct for Beijing, diversifying suppliers, routes, but also the type of energy is really important. Military assistance hasn't been provided in that form so far. It's been really limited to dual-use goods as semiconductors and drones, and that's sort of some sort of plausible deniability that it's for civilian use, which can obviously be repurposed, but that line hasn't been crossed yet. In terms of, again, financial side, economic side, Beijing didn't really rush in to buy all of the stranded Western assets that companies left there. It hasn't provided capital to Russian companies or increased its investment. So it's still in this wait and see mode to support Russia or not, and to what extent. So China isn't interested in Russia being humiliated and basically regime collapse, if you want, on its border. But it's also not interested in this war being dragged on. So the longer this war is continuing, the trickier will be for Beijing to toe this very delicate line. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Maria. Very interesting. We have passed the 9 o'clock line, so do get your questions ready while we're waiting. Maybe one quick question to András. Both your co-panelists touched on it. Military supplies by the Chinese to the Russian army. We haven't seen any significant deliveries, but what could the Chinese deliver? Also, would their support be critical in which dimensions?
Thank you. I fully agree with Maria. that Chinese are very, very careful about crossing the line between lethal and non-lethal assistance. So far, there have been some information published about a very small amount of kind of lethal weapons transferred to Russia. We speak here about 1,000 rifles. It doesn't change anything. Chinese, in the customs documents, they labeled the rifles as hunting rifles. Still, 1,000 piece doesn't matter. What Russia would like to get the most would be artillery ammunition, because there is a considerable level of interoperability between older Chinese artillery systems and Russian artillery systems. So China could provide Russia theoretically with really large amounts of artillery ammunition for the 152 millimeter howitzers, 122 millimeters, 120 millimeters mortars. So there are a lot of things Russia would like to get, but Chinese are really cautious. The most important part of the Chinese military use assistance, but it's not military, it's dual use, to Russia's war effort are the drones. I mean, taking into account, I mean, Politico published, I think it was Politico, a few days ago, based on some customs documents, that China exported already drones, I mean, commercial drones to Russia in the worth of $12 million. This was the DGI, the Chinese drone producer company. $12 million drones worth for $12 million. Dear colleagues, such a light drone costs around $1,000–2,000. These are small, cheap systems, which the Russians use basically for artillery observation and reconnaissance. So these are not attack drones, these are not suicide drones, these are just for observation. But even an artillery observation drone can kill because it directs artillery fire. I mean, if the number of about drones transferred to Russia in the value of $12 million is true, it means thousands of drones. So this actually matters. And the article also pointed out that this was just one transfer or one batch of transfers. Probably a lot more is going on. So China is tacitly helping Russia, not with lethal weapons, but with more dual-use products. But most likely these dual-use products are shipped to Russia in really large quantities. I hope this helps.
Thank you very much. Mr. Klimkin, as we talk about the Chinese and their role, they're sort of, since the Munich Security Conference and the subsequent publication of this principles paper by the Chinese, do you see that some Europeans are sort of over-optimistic as to the Chinese role they can play? I mean, you've already shared your assessment, but do you see that in Europe there are sort of hopes, people get hopes up which are not really justified?
Yeah, absolutely. Over-optimistic is sort of subjective notion, but I believe the Chinese have been playing it really well on Ukraine so far from a purely Chinese angle. They have not made as András and Maria also have said, any big mistake in the sense of trying to balance, not to cross real red lines on lethal weapons, but at the same time helping the Russians a lot. And it's not only about oil and gas, but actually the Chinese are tough on conditions for the new gas pipeline. They want to extract more from the Russians. But what is critical for the Russians, I fully agree with András, it's old Russian style artillery and munitions, but also, and it's even more critical for me, all kind of dual use, but especially high-end chips. What is needed for weapons production, for missiles, for tanks, basically for everything. We know that it's coming in Russia not only from China, it's also the Gulf countries. It's actually quite considerably Turkey, what we see in the sense of different dual use. And for me, when we talk about sanctions, of course, we want more sanctions, but first we need to close the gaps, because the gaps partially decimate the whole impact of sanctions. Secondly, I believe the Chinese are smart on feeling the moment, how and in what way to raise the stakes. They published their paper on so-called global security principles, and it's quite smart, because it's in a way kind of Helsinki principles minus the sense of human rights. Human rights are fundamentally not there. And a kind of manipulation on let's adjust these principles to any sort of reality. And the sense of adjustment is what actually lure a lot of countries from the non-Western reality. So China could be probably the one in the sense of having leverages on Putin. Now I understand that China and Russia is kind of double Starlink system, but it's 1 to 10. And it's about the Chinese to have this leverage. But from what I see, it's not a kind of unlimited leverage. What Xi and the Chinese have over the Russians now. So over optimistic, I would not say so. China could play a role, not now. It's not in substance, not in momentum, but China will raise the stakes definitely later. For China, and it's really my point here, it's also about participating in the discussion on European security architecture. And for China, it's also about START free treaty to be delivered and implemented without the Chinese. These are fundamentally crucial Chinese interests, and they weigh actually more for China than any sense of twist around being mediator. And for me, China would play actually these big goals, but not the goals on mediating us in Russia, at least for the moment again.
Many thanks. I think there really clearly is a question about sort of China playing a sort of intermediate role, because it's clearly positioned in support of Russia in so many ways. Would it be acceptable from a Ukrainian perspective to have Beijing sort of taking this role of sort of as a mediator?
Yeah, it's very interesting point. I discussed it also with other friends, and I have no clear answer here, because there is a discussion on that in Ukraine, but the overwhelming view, yes, we could take the Chinese on board, but not for the sake of having them on board, but under clear conditions and under, sticking to the principles. I'm actually quite critical on this look. I would love to have clear policy on how much China we could have in Ukraine in the future, and how much China we could have in the negotiation process in the future. So for me, it's not about tactics. For me, it's about strategy.
Thank you very much. And while we wait for questions, and maybe can I sort of repeat my my appeal to you? Please put your questions to the panel if you have any. Now is a good time to raise your hand. Maybe to Maria, Pavlo Klimkin says there's a leverage the Chinese enjoying over the Russians, but it's not unlimited. Sort of, how big would you say, is it possible to quantify sort of how big an potential influence that the Chinese would have over the Russian leadership?
I think it's a great question, and it can be expanded towards how much could she influence the whole course of the war, or even potentially deter Putin, as I was asking the other webinar yesterday. And we have to say that there is a chemical relationship. They are they call each other a dear friend, as we heard. The two have met, I believe, now 39 times, if I counted correctly. I think only former Japanese Prime Minister Abe was reaching to that level about 27 times he met with Putin. So there is definitely this chemical, this relationship of friendship between them, but ultimately two countries have their own national interests, right? China probably expected a short war around 3 days, perhaps of a limited scope around Donbass. I doubt it was communicated in excruciating detail, the full-scale course of the war that would be dragging for so long. So China can influence to a certain degree, but I would agree with Pavlo that there are certainly limitations what they can do. And I think to that point is Putin's announcement after 2 days with meeting with Xi that he would deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus, something that China included in its peace plan, that no nuclear weapons should be deployed in third countries. So clearly there is a strategic autonomy on both sides, what they can give to each other. And the same could be, I think, flicked for sort of swapped in the other direction. How much can Putin influence Xi in terms of invasion of Taiwan? Probably also to a minimal extent.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, András has to leave us now. I would have loved his assessment of what are the sort of scenarios for the next maybe 2-3 months to go forward. Maybe one quick answer to that.
All right, thank you. I need to be very quick again. Sorry for having to leave a bit earlier. I think everything depends on now the Ukrainian counterattack, or as Pavlo said, counterattacks, namely three variables. When do the counterattack start? How they progress, and with what price? This will define the upcoming few months, and also probably the upcoming 6 months, namely how Russia would react to these counterattacks. So we need to watch in the short run the weather reports when the ground starts drying, and from then on need to watch the start of the Ukrainian counterattack. And again, the three variables: how deep, how quick, and at what price. Everything will depend on it. Again, so need to leave now. I apologize for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, András. And now we have a question. Philip Hirsemenzel, please introduce yourself and put your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for this great insight. So my question pertains to the brackets renewable energy field, and as that's the field that I'm mainly working in. So obviously, you know, I mean, we just had a big conference in Berlin, a 2-day conference on the international energy transition, and one of the things we heard was the amount of, I think it was 50% of the entire solar capacity of the Ukraine that has been destroyed by the Russians. Of course, there were the repeated attacks on the grid infrastructure, on substations, and of course on the nuclear power plants. So my question is, since China, again in brackets, unfortunately, is providing 95% of all of the stuff that we need for the energy transition, obviously the Ukraine is also highly dependent on it and rebuilding it. And there's been a lot of talk about, of course, rebuilding the system more from a renewable perspective, not so much from a CO2 perspective, but also from a cost and a resilience perspective. So do you see a danger of China sort of weaponizing that against the Ukraine? Or do you think that the supply lines will remain open? There have been a couple of signs in recent months that China is looking towards controlling the strategically controlling the exports. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can add one question from the chat by Oliver Hoff. He asked about the sort of the fundamentals of the Chinese-Ukraine relationship, and that sort of I think it plays a role in the BRI strategy also, and sort of what what is this traditionally has been the relations between Kyiv and Beijing, and now we have this obvious phase of sort of where Xi is not sort of engaging with the Ukrainian president, but maybe you can give us a sense of that as well, Pavlo, please.
Yes, thanks. It's a very good point, because we were able to balance our energy system because of solar. Actually, it's a fact which is still not known for everybody. Of course, our solar capacity has been blown a lot, especially in the south, but now it's actually the backbone of balancing our electricity system. So the point on China trying to impact possible exports of energy-related goods to Ukraine, I don't see it now, and I don't hear it from the Chinese experts who are close to the government. And they actually, in one way or another, somehow close to the government. But I also don't see kind of real threat of challenging Europe with that. Actually, the other way around. For China, it's a real fundamental nightmare to have the collective West as such. A sort of West based on one strategy, supported and maintained with a clear solidarity. And here, the goals of Russia and China, not in a direct way, but fundamentally overlap. The Chinese don't want to have the collective West. They want to have US, they want to have Europe or parts of Europe, Australia, and all kind of stuff. So fundamentally, the Chinese would do everything in order to drive wedges in transatlantic solidarity, what we see on a number of different areas. And the second point, indeed, in the time of Yanukovych, there were a number of credit agreements and so-called big treaty on strategic partnership. The Chinese took their time to ratify it. It took a couple of years, but the Chinese are very pragmatic. They are always adjusting to the situation. So all these treaties are definitely there in legal sense, but politically, China is playing a fundamentally different game now. And China's game is everything is possible in this world and nothing is possible without China. So it's not about us to influence everything, but anything important could not be and should not be kind of agreed without us. And it's not just about yuan, your exports, or just about technology. It's about China becoming, in a purely business sense, having a sort of blocking minority for everything in this world. So everything which is 10 years old in the sense of Chinese-Ukrainian relation is pretty much forgotten.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Maria, do you want to come in on that?
Just briefly, I fundamentally agree overall with Pavlo's comments. I think the timing and against who China would use such a threat, weaponization, I think matters. I think there is a potential, given again the control of about 80% of supply chains of solar panels, overall technology that is necessary for green transition. But I think, so the question I would ask myself is if it's now, why? I mean, Ukraine's green transition is really further down the line. We're not talking about this yet. It's an aspiration, but we have to do the immediate reconstruction for the moment. So that's not the major concern or the pretext to weaponize it now. If it's done against Europe, I think that there is potentially a bigger threat here. But again, in the current context, China is trying to be friendly again with Europe, given its very thorny relationship with the US, and it needs partners ultimately in this world as well. It's not trying to alienate everyone here. So yes and no, the potential is there, but I think that the timing would be key when to use it, or if to use it.
Thank you very much. There's another question by Boris Ginsburg. If you introduce yourself and put your question.
Hello, my name is Boris Ginsburg. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. I have two short questions to Mr. Klimkin. Mr. Klimkin, the first question is, during the visit of the Chinese leader in Moscow, Zelensky also met the Japanese Prime Minister. How would you describe the relationship between Ukraine and Japan, especially during this whole difficult situation towards Russia and China? And the last question, in the last month, I observed a very interesting discussion in the Ukrainian media and among the experts in Ukraine. Zelensky said in April 2022 that Ukraine will become a kind of a big Israel after the war. I would like to ask you, do you think that the security circumstances of Israel are comparable to the security circumstances of Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe hold on for 1 second. I saw that Tom O'Donnell in the chat also wanted to come in.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's a little bit loud here. I'm stuck here. I wanted to ask any of the panelists who would like to answer. I see this great dilemma for Germany. German leaders, both business and political, are trying to make a distinction between the relationship, what Russia is up to in the world and what China is up to in the world, in a way that the Americans, more open, I would say, to China, more so than the Americans. Obviously, if China did go closer to Russia in this war, this would be a disaster for Germany, because with some sort of deindustrialization and all the energy problems for business in Germany, to have to cut with China would be quite a disaster. But there's other aspects to this, just very briefly, is that as China tries to maintain good relations somehow in Europe and with Ukraine, not to excite the West, meanwhile, they push ahead incrementally on the islands and so forth in the South China Sea that the Americans might have to draw a line on. And so if someone would like to discuss this sort of dilemma for Germany, I'd be very interested.
Thanks, Tom. This is a very big question. We have only 4 minutes left, so I think we'll do our best. Pavlo first, please.
Yes, thanks a lot for that. On the first one, on Japan, it's easy. Our relations to Japan are definitely going upwards in any sense, whether it's security, maybe not direct security, but on cyber, on any other issues, or on financial assistance. There is a joke between us that we have actually the same problem, one neighbor. So it's whether it's geographically or not, but the perception is there. So on Israel, look, I don't believe our security realities are comparable. There is a very famous concept of giving Ukraine a sort of sense of deterrence through a kind of porcupine strategy. somehow to arm Ukraine and to support and maintain our resilience to the level that we can be sort of porcupine, which is kind of threatening to everyone, including Russia. But it's a kind of different strategy. And I believe we need to discuss different strategy of deterrence towards Russia and different strategy of strategic weakening, but they can be comparable to Israel. On the third one, Thomas, actually it's a sort of, separate discussion for an hour to be, but let me say so, look, I don't believe China and Russia would create a sort of, defense community and economic community. In Chinese, you don't have a direct translation to an ally. Partners are there, relations are there, but there is no sense of being allies with someone. China is clearly understanding that Russia has been weakening, and China is also clearly understanding that the Russian construction is there and has some resilience, but not stable for the sort of long-term perspective. And they're gonna be guided by long-term perspective. What I actually follow now, at least in Beijing. But in the sense of dilemma, you basically raised, yes, I agree, there is a fundamental dilemma now in Germany. And it's the point why the German security strategy has not been presented. It's about China, mainly, not only, we understand each other, but it's mainly about China. And now Germany is facing a fundamental challenge. What is about Central Europe? What is about Europe? What is about Germany's role in Europe? What is Germany's role towards Russia and China? And all these questions are unfortunately unanswered. Or fortunately, maybe, actually both. But it's a very good topic, but we need actually sort of separate discussion of that.
Absolutely, and we are sort of with an eye on the clock. We are almost finished. Maria, maybe do you want to have a last word on your position?
Just quickly, it is indeed, I think, a headache for Germany how to decouple from Russia and at the same time trying to find the right strategy towards China. Hence, we see the change of the words. It's about de-risking. I think Ursula von der Leyen today will focus on that. What does it mean and how to, again, balance the two strategies, which will be ultimately harmful for Germany, at least that's the perceptions, the concerns of de-industrializations. But I think the world we live in, that ultimately you have to minimize your vulnerabilities, to think about, things that can be weaponized. And that will be hard to do so. I do believe that China and Russia have different objectives ultimately. So finding different strategy is also, I think, the right way to go here.
Thank you very much. And with that, I have two more sort of short announcements. If you want to read more about the question we've just discussed, have a look at the most recent issue of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Just came out a few days ago on the China challenge, especially for Europe. Then I should tell you that we are taking a break for 2 weeks because of Easter. So we will reconvene on the 20th of April. Look out for the invitation and the subject we will be discussing then. But for now, please join me in thanking our panelists, Maria Shagina and Pavlo Klimkin. Thank you for joining us this morning, for your questions and comments. And on a personal note, maybe I add to Mr. Klimkin, I think I speak for very many when I express my great admiration for the bravery and the morale of the Ukrainians in dealing with this aggression, and I wish you all the very best for the month ahead. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
you.